There are empires that collapse from war, and others that rot from within. England's golden age was ruled by a queen whose crown glittered brighter than any star, but beneath that crown, her body was decaying while she was still alive. Picture a monarch so feared that men knelt before her, yet so foul in scent that ambassadors almost fainted at her presence. Her teeth blackened into stumps, her skin peeled away beneath a mask of white poison, and her body exhaled the perfume of death long before her heart stopped beating. This is not myth. This is the true body of Queen Elizabeth I, the woman who turned beauty into a battlefield and her own flesh into a tomb. From the outside, the world saw perfection. The Virgin Queen radiant, untouchable, divine. She ruled an empire that crushed armadas, silenced popes, and made poets worship her like a goddess. But step inside her chambers, and the illusion collapses. There, behind the velvet curtains and the golden mirrors, the air was thick, a mix of roses, sweat, and something far darker. Servants whispered that the queen's scent lingered long after she left a room, not from perfume but from rot. And though the kingdom bowed before her, her own body had declared war against itself. Her teeth were the first to surrender. Sugar, that sweet treasure of the new world, had become her addiction. She devoured it daily, believing it proof of royal luxury. Yet by her 30s, her mouth had become a graveyard. Teeth loosened and fell like leaves. Gomsplil. And every smile became a wound. Courtiers avoided her breath, which was said to carry the stench of death itself. Still, she refused all treatment. When a physician begged to extract a decayed tooth, she ordered him to pull his own out first, and when he did, screaming, bleeding, collapsing, she smiled, victorious, as if defying pain itself were a form of sovereignty. But the real horror was her fear of water. Elizabeth believed bathing could kill her, that water seeped through the pores, drowning the spirit from within. So instead of cleansing, she covered. Her daily routine was a ritual of deception: rose water instead of soap, perfume instead of purity, petals instead of washing. Beneath hair gowned 6, sometimes 7 layers of silk and lace, her skin suffocated, coated in oil, sweat, and decaying perfume. Maids whispered that her bedclothes stood upright from stiffness, and that her nightgown reeked so sweetly of corruption that even the hounds refused to enter her chambers. Yet, in her mind, she was immaculate, cleaner than the world itself. Then came the paint, that mask of divine whiteness that defined an era. The iconic face that still stares from portraits was built from poison. Venetian ceruse, a blend of lead and vinegar, created her snow-white glow. She applied it daily, layer upon layer, until her skin stopped breathing. Beneath the powder, her flesh festered, sores split open, blood mixed with makeup. And still she smiled, powdered again and again. When she was 29, smallpox left her scarred. From that moment, vanity became survival. "My face is my throne," she would say, and so she ruled, painted and dying, her beauty eating her alive. But even paint could not hide the decay beneath her crown. Her fiery red hair, once her glory, fell away in clumps, poisoned by the very cosmetics meant to preserve it. In its place came the wigs, towering, perfumed, and heavy as guilt. Some weighed nearly 20 pounds, woven from horsehair and corpses, glued with animal fat and starch. Beneath them, her scalp oozed sores, alive with insects. Yet to remove the wig was to remove the illusion, and no one dared expose the truth. They said her wig was sanctified before being placed on her head each morning. They said, if it shifted during a ceremony, the court froze until it was adjusted. Her hair had become a holy relic of deception. And through all of it, she smiled. She spoke in courtly riddles, laughed through clenched pain, and signed treaties with trembling hands that could barely hold a quill. The lead and mercury coursing through her veins drove her toward madness, paranoia, sleeplessness, hallucinations. She forbade mirrors in her chambers. She raged at shadows, accusing maids of betrayal. Yet her portraits remained flawless. The people saw only the goddess, not the woman beneath, whose own reflection had become her enemy. When death finally came in the year 6003, it was not gentle. Her body, steeped for decades in toxins and perfume, decomposed faster than any royal corpse before her. The skin burst. The lips fused. Dark fluid seeped from her nostrils. Guards rotated every 10 minutes at her coffin because the stench overpowered even the gardens of Westminster. Yet the public never knew. They saw only the painted death mask, serene and beautiful. As the legend demanded, the Virgin Queen remained untouchable even as she rotted beneath her crown. But the tragedy of Elizabeth was not merely physical. It was the curse of illusion, the belief that image could defeat mortality. She ruled through myth, but the myth consumed her. Every petal, every drop of perfume, every stroke of white paint brought her closer to the grave she carried within. Beneath the gilded portraits, beneath the hymns of glory, the truth decayed quietly. Her flesh had become her prison, her beauty, her poison, her crown, her coffin. And so the story begins of the queen who turned her own body into England's darkest secret, the woman who chose power over purity, and in doing so, ensured that even death could not wash her clean. For Elizabeth did not die a legend. She died a lesson, and the smell of her throne still lingers through history. In the late 16th century, the English court was a theater of perfume and plague, where whispers traveled faster than the wind through silk corridors, and at the center of it all stood a queen with a mouth that terrified even her physicians. The story of Elizabeth's teeth was not merely one of vanity, but of decay as rebellion, for her mouth became the first battlefield between flesh and crown. Between the truth of mortality and the illusion of majesty, what began as the sweetness of power imported sugar, glittering like diamonds from the Caribbean, soon turned her smile into a mausoleum of black stumps and bleeding gums. It began quietly. In her 20s, she was praised for her radiant smile, the kind that disarmed men and sealed treaties. Sugar was rare, costly, divine, and she devoured it daily, believing sweetness a mark of sovereignty. But sugar, as the world would learn, devours in return. By the time she reached 30, her teeth had turned gray, then black, her gums swollen with infection. Ambassadors wrote home that the Virgin Queen's breath smelled of the grave. At first, courtiers dismissed it as slander, but soon no amount of rose petals or cloves could mask the truth. Pain became her constant companion, yet she never confessed it aloud. To admit weakness was treason against her image. She chewed in silence, grinding soft bread until her jaw ached, sipping thin soups prepared by trembling servants who dared not look her in the face. Her court doctors were horrified. They begged her to allow treatment to extract the rotting teeth before the infection spread. One physician, bold and desperate, presented himself with surgical tools in hand. Elizabeth stared at him, her eyes cold and mocking, and said, Prove to me it does not hurt. He hesitated. Then, under her command, pulled out his own tooth before the court. He screamed, bled, and collapsed before the Queen's throne. Elizabeth watched without blinking, then smiled through her own pain and dismissed him forever. Power, she believed, was not in the cure, but in the endurance. The court learned never to mention her mouth again. By her 40s, her speech began to slur. Words, once sharp as arrows, grew thick, muffled. Haunted by pain, the grand orator who once held her nation spellbound could no longer speak clearly. Even Shakespeare, who adored her, adjusted his lines to spare her certain sounds. At banquets, she avoided meat altogether. The royal chefs boiled every dish until it turned to paste, serving it on silver plates to disguise the reality that England's queen could no longer chew. When forced to dine before guests, she hid behind her fan, pretending to eat, swallowing only wine and air. Her attendants swore secrecy under oath. Some kept it, others could not. One maid later wrote that the smell from the Queen's mouth was so foul, I feared to breathe beside her. Another said the odor followed her through corridors, a trail of invisible death perfumed by desperation. Yet Elizabeth refused all remedies. Instead, she invented rituals to disguise her suffering. She chewed petals soaked in wine to perfume her breath, stuffed cloves between her gums, and brushed her teeth with honey, the worst choice possible, but one she thought divine. She even had her utensils made from silver, believing the reflection would make her smile appear whiter. Silver, of course, could not hide decay. It only gleamed in contrast to the ruin it framed. Still, she smiled for portraits, bearing what remained of her teeth, lifeless pegs, as one ambassador cruelly described them, and the artists painted perfection. To reveal the truth was to risk death. Her vanity was not ignorance, it was defiance. Elizabeth understood that her body was failing, that every tooth she lost marked another piece of mortality clawing through the armor of her crown. But in the language of her time, pain was weakness, and women could not afford weakness, so she turned agony into ritual and rot into power. Her smile became a weapon, her silence a performance. She ruled, not despite her decay, but through it. Each grimace at the dinner table, each red stain on her napkin, became a testament to her will to remain untouchable. In her later years, the infection reached her jawbone. Her face hollowed, her cheeks collapsed inward. Some claimed her breath could wilt flowers. Others swore that standing close to her for too long made their eyes water. Still, she painted her lips crimson, stood beneath the chandeliers, and welcomed foreign envoys with the same elegance as always. When one Spanish diplomat described her as a graveyard with a crown, he was recalled home for disrespect. No one, not even the truth, was allowed to mock the Virgin Queen. The symbolism was cruelly perfect. Her mouth, once the voice of empire, had become the grave of her own body. Each black tooth, each wound in her gum, whispered the same warning that power is always borrowed, and the flesh always collects its debt. But Elizabeth would never yield that debt in life. She chose pride over pain, image over healing, and thus transformed her own suffering into a spectacle of sovereignty. When she smiled, England trembled, not because her beauty enchanted them, but because they sensed, beneath the powder and perfume, the terrible truth she refused to hide. Her body was dying, and she was ruling anyway. Her smile had become a battlefield. Her teeth, her soldiers, and in that silent, rotting mouth, the legend of the Virgin Queen took root. A legend built not on purity, but on decay itself. To understand the true horror of Queen Elizabeth's reign, one must walk past the throne, beyond the gold and lace, into her chambers, a place where light suffocated beneath curtains heavy with perfume. There, the air was thick and sour, carrying the strange sweetness of rot, because to Elizabeth, water was not life. It was death. She believed bathing could seep disease into the blood, that each droplet carried invisible poison waiting to drown her from within. And so, in a kingdom surrounded by rivers, the Queen of England became terrified of her own reflection in a bowl of water. Her physicians, armed with superstition instead of science, confirmed her fears. Water enters the pores, they warned, and never leaves. Elizabeth took this as law. She declared bathing unnecessary, even dangerous. The bath in her private chamber, a porcelain tub gilded with cherubs and framed in marble, stood as decoration, a monument to a ritual she would not perform. When she did enter it, rarely, the act resembled a ceremony for the dead. The servants poured warm water mixed with rose petals, marigolds, and wine, careful not to let a single drop touch her face. They whispered prayers as she sat motionless, like a saint painted in decay. The petals clung to her skin, sliding down pale arms coated with oil. And when she rose from the bath, the water looked like a broth of melted wax and sweat. The attendants later confessed that they could hardly breathe from the smell, a thick, floral sweetness masking the deeper stench beneath. To Elizabeth, cleanliness was not purity but illusion. She believed her perfumes were protection, her oils, armor against disease. Her maids were ordered to dab her body daily, with cloths soaked in vinegar, lavender, and wine. Never scrub, never rinse. Each layer of residue built upon the last until her skin became a living canvas of musk and myrrh. Beneath the gowns, sometimes 6, sometimes more, her body steamed with moisture trapped between flesh and silk. Servants whispered that her undergarments could stand upright from stiffness. The smell, they said, was unbearable. Yet she insisted that her natural scent was divine, the odor of royalty. When a maid once suggested changing the bedsheets more often, Elizabeth dismissed her for insolence. "My scent," she said, "is the perfume of England." Foreign visitors were less poetic. A French envoy recorded that when he approached her throne, he nearly fainted, not from awe, but from the sweet, sickly odor of decay mingled with roses. Others joked cruelly that England's rose had begun to rot on its stem. None dared say it aloud. The Queen's vanity had grown as thick as her perfume. To suggest that she smelled like death was to risk meeting it personally. And yet, the truth spread in murmurs through the corridors of Whitehall and Richmond. Their monarch was decomposing beneath her finery. Her sheets, heavy with oils, were rarely washed. Her nightgown hardened from sweat until it resembled armor. In winter, the stench was trapped inside. In summer, it rose from her body like smoke from incense. Maids fainted at her bedside. And still she believed herself clean. Clean, she once declared, is what pleases the eyes, not what soothes the skin. She measured purity not by touch but by sight, a philosophy that would damn her flesh. By her middle years, her skin had begun to rebel. Beneath her corsets bloomed sores. Her thighs chafed raw. Her back streaked with red patches that no powder could hide. When physicians tried to apply ointments, She screamed and accused them of witchcraft. She believed they meant to drown her from within, and ordered the offending doctor whipped. From that day forward, no one attempted to wash her again. Instead, they masked the wounds with perfume until the stench became unbearable. A constant, invisible presence that followed her wherever she went, to banquets, to sermons, even to Parliament. And yet, for all this filth, she demanded immaculate perfection from her courtiers. Men were banished for smelling of sweat. Women were dismissed for greasy hair. The court became a theater of deception, a place where everyone stank in silence, pretending to be divine. One ambassador wrote that England's queen hates what she is. Perhaps he was right. Beneath the layers of silk, beneath the powder, she was not the virgin queen, but a woman terrified of her own body. As years passed, her rituals grew stranger. Each morning, she was anointed with oils of amber and civet. Candles burned continuously in her chamber to disguise the odor. No one spoke of it. No one dared. Her attendants grew pale and thin from the fumes, yet Elizabeth thrived on them. The perfume was her protection. Hair disguise, her invisible crown. She believed it separated her from the common filth of the world, not realizing that it was that very perfume turning her into the filth she feared. And so the queen who conquered empires became prisoner to her own scent. The fear of water, the simplest element of life, had become her religion. In her mind, she was not avoiding disease. She was purifying herself from mortality. But every day she avoided the bath. Her body wrote a different gospel, one of rot, of wounds that refused to heal, of flesh suffocating beneath luxury. Her servants would later say that to serve her was to breathe decay, and to love her was to endure it. Yet Elizabeth remained unshaken. She mistook the smell of her own corruption for divinity. She turned stench into symbol, decay into dignity. The queen who feared water became the queen who drowned in perfume. And every night, as she lay in her bed of unwashed linens, she believed herself eternal, not realizing that the very scent she adored was already preparing her body for death. By the time Queen Elizabeth reached her late 20s, her fear of water had merged with a new, more dangerous obsession: the perfection of her face. England adored her image, pale as the moon, unblemished as porcelain, an icon of divine purity. But beneath that gleam, her skin bore the marks of war, literal pits from smallpox that scarred her cheeks and left her terrified that the world would see her as mortal. From that terror was born the white mask, the painted lie that defined her reign and destroyed her flesh. It began as vanity, but it ended as poison. Her cosmetic of choice was called Venetian ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar imported from Italy, celebrated among nobles for its smooth, shining finish. Every morning, Elizabeth's ladies prepared the paste like priests mixing incense, stirring the thick, chalky liquid in silver bowls until it gleamed like milk. The queen sat before her mirror as the attendants dabbed it onto her face, neck, and hands. It smelled faintly of metal and death. The first layer brightened her pallor, the second concealed the scars, the third erased the human beneath. Over the years, this ritual became her armor. "My face," she declared, "is my kingdom." And indeed, she ruled from behind that mask, convincing her people that she was immortal, while her body decayed quietly underneath. At first, the transformation was intoxicating. The courtiers gasped at her beauty, skin so white it glowed under candlelight, lips painted vermilion red with mercury sulfide, cheeks brushed with cinnabar powder to mimic a feverish blush. But the brilliance was an illusion born of toxins The lead sank into her pores, seeping into her blood, poisoning her from within. Her skin dried and cracked. Open sores formed where the paste had hardened. When her maids tried to remove it, the flesh peeled away with the paint. They begged her to stop. She refused. "The people see only what I show them," she said. "Let them never see what I am." Every year, she demanded heavier layers to cover the damage left by the year before. The mask grew thicker. The woman beneath grew thinner. The cracks on her face were filled with more ceruse until her cheeks no longer moved. Pain became part of her beauty. Smiling tore the corners of her lips. Blinking made her eyes bleed. The portraits from this era serene, statuesque, timeless, conceal the agony of a queen who could no longer express emotion without splitting her own skin. Painters learned to capture her stillness and call it grace. The poisons began to reshape her not only outwardly but within. Her veins absorbed lead. Her organs faltered. She suffered tremors, sleeplessness, and hallucinations. Her fingers stiffened. Her joints ached. Sometimes she would tremble while signing documents, blaming the cold. But her doctors knew the truth. The lead had reached her bones. One maid confessed that during makeup removal, she once found an open sore beneath the queen's jaw, so infected that she vomited. Elizabeth struck her across the face and ordered silence. No one spoke of it again. The tragedy deepened as mercury joined the ritual. To redden her lips, she used vermilion, a pigment of mercury sulfide. To line her eyes, lamp, black, made from soot and ash. To dilate her pupils, she used belladonna, a hallucinogenic plant that blurred her vision and clouded her mind. Each application was another prayer to the god of appearance. Each prayer answered with poison. Yet Elizabeth believed the rituals kept her alive. She saw in the mirror not a woman but a symbol, England's eternal virgin. Too divine for decay. And the more her body betrayed her, the more she painted herself into immortality. By her 40s, the mask had fused with her skin. Her face had become a battlefield of wounds, sealed under poison. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her eyebrows vanished. Her lashes dissolved. She ordered wigs of red curls to replace them, and new layers of powder to hide the discoloration of her forehead. When courtiers asked about her health, she laughed a brittle sound that cracked her lips and drew blood. She told them beauty was pain, and the pain of a queen was sacred. They applauded, too terrified to look closely. But in private, the mask began to crumble. Her attendants found blood on her pillow, flakes of white powder on her sheets, stains on her gowns where the paint had mixed with sweat. Still, she refused to be seen without it. Even when she fainted during dressing sessions, she would awaken gasping, demanding the paint be reapplied. "Do not leave me bare," she whispered. "Bare is death." Her terror of mortality was greater than the pain itself. The mask was no longer makeup. It was the only skin she had left. The poisons that preserved her myth also drove her to madness. She began accusing her maids of betrayal, her doctors of sorcery. Her moods turned violent. She would rage one moment, weep the next. The lead that bleached her beauty now clouded her mind. Yet, in public, she remained radiant, the painted deity her people adored. The paradox was complete. The queen who refused to bathe had now entombed herself in white paint, sealing her body inside a chemical shroud. Her final years were marked by exhaustion. The painting ritual took hours each morning. The candlelight shimmered on her face like moonlight on marble. And yet, beneath it, her blood had turned toxic. She could no longer sleep. She could barely eat. Each breath tasted of metal. When her hands shook uncontrollably, she had them tied during ceremonies to keep her movements regal. The courtiers never knew that the immortal Virgin Queen, the woman who had defeated the Armada, reshaped England, and stood above kings, was slowly being eaten alive by her own mirror. In time, her beauty became her disease, and her disease became her throne. The mask that had once crowned her as divine would soon claim her completely. For no crown weighs heavier than the one carved from your own flesh. By the time Queen Elizabeth crossed into her 40s, the illusion of divinity that she wore so carefully began to crack from the crown down. The radiant copper hair that had once dazzled poets and lovers alike, that flame-red halo which had become her signature, began to fall away in clumps. Her scalp, poisoned by the same toxic powders that masked her face, turned brittle and raw. Each morning, her maids found handfuls of hair tangled in her combs, slick with sweat and powder. The loss was catastrophic for a woman who equated beauty with sovereignty. Hair was not merely vanity in Elizabeth's court, it was power. It was the aura of youth, the symbol of command, the living crown that declared her eternal. And when it began to vanish, she replaced it with something more unnatural, more terrible wigs. They began modestly, simple constructions of auburn curls and silk threads. But as the years passed and her baldness spread, they grew higher, heavier, and more elaborate, until her head seemed to support a structure more architectural than human. The wigs were crafted from horsehair, goat hair, and, rumor claimed, the hair of the dead stiffened with starch and glued together with a mixture of egg whites, animal fat, and powdered lead. They were coated in white powder to match her pale face and perfumed to drown the smell of decay. Yet no perfume could hide what lay beneath. Her real scalp was a battlefield of infection, sores that oozed, wounds that refused to close. The flesh beneath soft and fevered from years of suffocation. One morning, as attendants carefully lifted the wig from her head, they froze. Beneath the layers of powder and fabric, something moved. Tiny white larvae writhed between her hairline and crown. They dared not scream. They powdered the area with lavender, replaced the wig, and swore to silence. The story would live only in whispers, that the Virgin Queen's crown crawled with life, that beneath the symbol of her divine beauty, worms were feasting. Still, the ritual continued. Every day, the wig was treated as holy. Before it touched her head, a priest murmured a prayer. If a strand fell, it was buried. The wig was more than disguise, it was relic. It was part of her myth. Some wigs were so massive that the palace architects had to raise the archways in certain rooms so she could pass through without bowing. The largest, recorded by one observer, was a fiery red creation, adorned with pearls and lace, weighing nearly 20 pounds. To support it, Elizabeth wore a steel collar beneath her gown. When she walked, the metal scraped her shoulders raw. But she endured it in silence. She had turned her suffering into ceremony, her pain into majesty. For her, even agony could be beautiful, if it kept her immortal. But beauty was no longer the truth, it was the weapon. Her courtiers saw the wigs and thought of power. Her enemies saw them and whispered of madness. They said she feared her reflection, that she never removed the wig before servants. When she slept, it remained in place, the pins digging into her scalp. The wounds deepened, festering. Her doctors begged to clean them. She banished them instead. "My scalp," she said, "is not your concern. It is England's crown." And so the infections spread. The constant weight of hair and pearls pressed sores into her skull. Sometimes blood seeped down the back of her neck, staining the lace of her collar, but she refused to yield. The crown had become a cage, and she wore it willingly. The wigs carried another danger beyond decay. The powders that dusted them were made from the same white lead that coated her skin. As she breathed it in day after day, the poison accumulated in her lungs, her liver, her bones. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. Her eyes lost their focus. The queen's body was turning against her, the toxins feasting on her from within, as worms feasted from without. Yet in public, she smiled, unbroken, heavy gleaming on a candlelight. No one dared approach too closely, not because of etiquette, but because the air around her reeked faintly of sweet decay masked by roses. The maintenance of her wigs became a nightly ritual, performed in near silence. Servants carried them to a private chamber, where they were soaked in vinegar to kill the insects, then hung near coals to dry. The heat never fully removed the moisture, so the wigs grew mold between their layers. The next morning, they would powder and perfume them again, disguising the rot with lilies and musk before presenting them to the queen. When one noblewoman dared to whisper that the queen's hair smelled of damp tombs, Elizabeth exiled her to Cornwall within a week. To mock the wig was to mock the monarchy. By her 50s, her scalp could no longer bear the weight. She began wearing a thin mesh of iron beneath the wigs to distribute the pressure, though the metal sliced her skin with every movement. She grew pale and dizzy. Her head throbbed constantly. One winter, she fainted during a council meeting, blood running from beneath the wig. But before she could even stand again, attendants replaced it on her head. The performance could not stop. The queen's illusion had to remain whole. The world could never see the ruin beneath the paint and hair. Historians later concluded that the heavy metals from her wigs, the lead, the mercury, the powders she inhaled, likely worsened her mental decline. Her paranoia deepened. She accused servants of treachery for adjusting the wigs too tightly. At times, she thought the hair whispered to her in her sleep. The line between the crown and the woman blurred. To her, the wig was no longer a disguise. It was her identity, her armor, her proof that she was above flesh. Even as her scalp rotted and the infection reached her skull, she wore it with pride. And so, the red curls of Elizabeth Tudor, once the emblem of life and defiance, became a relic of death. The worms beneath her wig were only the visible echo of what had already begun within a body consumed by vanity. A queen devoured by her own myth. Beneath the pearls and perfume, England's eternal flame had gone cold, leaving only the smell of decay behind her. Through the final decades of her life, Queen Elizabeth's body ceased to be merely human. It became a chamber, a closed system of perfumes, oils, and decay sealed beneath layers of silk and self-deception. To her subjects, she was the untouchable Virgin Queen, radiant and divine, but within the thick folds of her gowns, her flesh was fermenting. Trapped beneath fabric and fear, she had conquered nations, survived conspiracies, and outlived lovers. Yet she could not conquer the smell of her own power. It followed her like a ghost, a sweet, cloying scent that clung to her body and poisoned the air of every room she entered. Elizabeth's daily ritual was one of both devotion and denial. At dawn, her maids lit candles and incense to disguise the odor that seeped from her bed. They then began the anointing. Every inch of her body, from shoulders to feet, was rubbed with oil musk, civet, sandalwood, amber, each chosen for its strength, each mixed with the faint metallic tang of lead. The purpose was not to cleanse, but to consecrate. A queen, she once said, must never smell of earth. And so her body became sacred ground, unwashed, perfumed, and dying. The oils closed her pores, suffocating her skin until it could no longer breathe. Beneath the surface, a new kind of life began to grow: rashes, boils, and sores that festered in the dark warmth between corset and flesh. She wore as many as 6 layers of clothing, even in summer linen chemise, corset, petticoats, underskirts, bodice, and robe, each layer absorbing sweat and oil until the garments grew stiff and heavy. Removing them became impossible without tearing the fabric from her wounds. Maids said the stench would rise in waves when they unfastened her corset. A mix of sweetness and sickness that turned the stomach. Some fainted, others wept. But Elizabeth forbade pity. The scent of a queen is her power. She told them, if they smell me, they remember me. And so, what others perceived as rot, she considered reverence. Her scent filled entire halls. Foreign ambassadors wrote of it in letters they dared not sign. One described it as the perfume of roses left too long in the sun. Another claimed that when she passed by, the air remained heavy for hours, as though something divine or diseased had touched it. To be near her was to feel intoxicated and repulsed all at once. Yet, in the eyes of her people, that fragrance became mythic. The Virgin Queen did not sweat. She exhaled sanctity. No one spoke of the truth that her own body oils were curdling into poison beneath the lace. By her late 50s, the effects of this slow embalming began to show. Her skin took on a yellowish cast, the sign of failing liver, poisoned by lead and perfume. Her arms and thighs were streaked with open sores, where fabric had rubbed the skin raw. When physicians begged her to allow treatment, she dismissed them with contempt. She had long since equated suffering with sovereignty. Pain, to her, was proof that she was chosen by God. If my flesh burns, she said once, it is only because the crown is heavy. The courtiers applauded, even as they avoided standing too close. Her bedchamber became an alchemical tomb. Candles burned day and night to hide the smell. Bowls of lavender and rose petals lined the walls. The curtains were soaked in vinegar to purify the air. Yet the rot persisted. The perfume she once adored had turned rancid. The sweet oils fermented in the heat, releasing a scent that no servant could endure for long. Maids rotated in shifts, tending her body with trembling hands, wiping sweat that glistened like oil on marble. Every touch risked infection. But to refuse was treason. Despite her decaying body, Elizabeth still held court daily, dressed in finery that could hide the truth. Her gowns shimmered under candlelight, and from a distance, she looked ethereal, but those who approached felt their stomachs twist from the odor. Ambassadors described how the queen would raise her hand to gesture, and the movement released a wave of perfume, so thick it made their eyes water. They bowed lower, not from respect, but to avoid breathing. No one dared tell her. The scent of corruption had become inseparable from her image. It was as if her power itself had begun to rot. At night, her maids removed her clothing, layer by layer, revealing what the day's illusion had hidden: a body, discolored and damp, streaked with sores and flaking powder. They dabbed her with wine-soaked cloths, too afraid to use water, and re-oiled her skin before covering her again. The process took hours. One attendant wrote, years later, that she had seen the queen's skin shine like wax and peel like bark. Another claimed that when Elizabeth turned in her sleep, The sheets made a sound as if tearing parchment. Yet through all this, the queen never admitted illness. To her, the body was irrelevant. The crown was eternal. The irony was that her terror of decay had made her its prisoner. Every step she took left the scent of death trailing behind her. Her perfume had become prophecy, announcing to all who inhaled it that something within the monarchy was dying, that the Virgin Queen, the woman who had made England radiant, was now its ghost. Still, she refused to surrender the illusion. "So long as they fear me," she said, "I live." And so, Elizabeth reeked of power, literally and symbolically. The perfume that once drew admirers now warned of mortality. Her body had become her throne, her prison, and her curse, embalmed in oils before death could even claim it. Beneath the silks and diamonds, beneath the reverence and myth, England's eternal queen was slowly turning to dust while still breathing. By the twilight of her reign, the poisons that had preserved Queen Elizabeth's illusion began to claim their final prize, her mind. The same white paint that turned her skin ghostly, the same powders that coated her wigs, the same oils that embalmed her living body had seeped into her blood, crossing the fragile borders between flesh and thought. It started as sleeplessness, the kind that twisted nights into endless corridors of candlelight and murmurs. She would pace the floors of Whitehall in silence, her feet bare, her eyes wide and shining like glass. The servants said she no longer blinked. They heard her whisper to herself, speaking to people who were no longer there, to her dead advisors, her lost lovers, the ghosts of a youth she had painted out of existence. Her temper, once sharp but regal, turned volatile. The slightest noise could ignite her rage. She accused her maids of betrayal for adjusting her collar, of witchcraft for brushing her hair too roughly. Once, when a servant dropped a pin near her dressing table, she screamed that he had cursed her and ordered him whipped. The court began to move in silence around her, terrified of the storms that could erupt at any moment. Yet in public, she appeared unchanged, the same serene mask of power, the same smile that had conquered kings. Her madness was invisible behind the cosmetics, hidden behind the glow of candles and the weight of her crown. The lead in her veins made her hands tremble uncontrollably. She hid it by folding them together in prayer, or clutching her jeweled fan so tightly that her knuckles cracked beneath the paint. Her spine curved inward, her shoulders hunched, but her gowns were cut to disguise it. And her portraits painted her straight-backed and eternal. The contradiction became her existence, a queen who could barely walk but appeared to float, a monarch whose words slurred in private but rang clear in ceremony. Only those closest to her saw the truth, the spasms, the fainting spells, the way her eyes sometimes rolled back as if she were trying to see through her own skull. At times, she grew lucid, aware that something was slipping away. She would sit before her mirror, staring at the pale statue that looked back, and whisper, "Who are you?" But she never waited for the answer. She had banished all mirrors from her chambers long before. Only a few small ones remained, polished silver surfaces that distorted her reflection into something unrecognizable. When she caught sight of herself by accident, she would cover her face and command that the room be emptied. The sight of her own body had become unbearable. Paranoia spread like a shadow across her court. She became convinced that everyone sought her crown. Even the walls seemed to conspire. She ordered letters burned, tapestries replaced, doors sealed. Her counselors, once confidants, now spoke to her in riddles and prayers, terrified of provoking her. The court, once brilliant and poetic, became a mausoleum of whispers. Servants wept in secret, not from pity, but from the suffocating dread that the palace itself was decaying, its scent of rose oil and smoke, masking something darker, the odor of their queen's unraveling mind. At night, she wandered. The maids would wake to the creak of floorboards and the faint sound of silk brushing stone. They found her standing before the throne in her nightgown, her crown tilted on her head, her eyes fixed on nothing. When they begged her to return to bed, she told them she was waiting for morning, though no one dared ask what she expected to see when dawn came. Some whispered that she believed sleep was a kind of death, and she had already decided never to die. Her delusions became ritual. She held conversations with her own reflection in the air, nodded at invisible messengers, laughed suddenly, then wept. The poisons that preserved her beauty had corroded her nerves. Her heart raced unpredictably. Her skin turned fragile as parchment, bruising at the slightest touch. Even her voice began to change, losing its strength. "Do not call me old," she snapped once, "for the crown does not age." And yet, the crown heavy with pearls and gilt was crushing her neck, pressing into the infected scalp beneath her wigs. Her pain became permanent, and she began to confuse it with divinity. "The Lord gives me pain to remind me I am chosen," she said to her physicians, who no longer dared reply. Every corner of the palace became an echo chamber of her madness. Portraits of her younger self hung on the walls, eyes bright, hair aflame, equude, skin immaculate, while the real woman shuffled past them, trembling, hollow-eyed, caked in powder. She forbade their removal. She could not let time erase her myth. Even as time erased her body, the courtiers bowed deeper each day, not out of reverence, but out of fear that the illusion might crumble if they looked too long. By the final years, Elizabeth existed in two realms at once, one of marble and oil and memory, where she reigned forever young, and one of flesh and rot, where she was falling apart. Her crown was no longer gold, but iron pressed against her scalp. The wig beneath it throbbed with infection. She no longer distinguished pain from purpose. Every grimace was mistaken for a smile, every tremor for majesty. Her body, once a kingdom, had become a prison, and her mind was its last captive. Still, she ruled. Still, she signed decrees, delivered speeches, attended ceremonies. The people saw a goddess. Her servants saw a ghost. She had become the perfect symbol of her own empire, powerful, magnificent, and quietly dying from the inside. Beneath the crown, the madness had found its throne, and England, too devoted to the myths she built, would not notice the rot until it was far too late. Under the dim March skies of the year 6003, silence fell upon Whitehall Palace. The woman who had once ruled empires now sat motionless upon her bed, her crown resting beside her like a relic of another life. Queen Elizabeth I, England's immortal virgin, had stopped speaking. Her courtiers hovered outside the chamber, terrified of the stillness, unwilling to admit what it meant. The great queen who feared sleep whispered to her maids that if she closed her eyes, she would not open them again. And she was right. Her body, long poisoned by the very substances that had once preserved her image, was already collapsing from within. The mixture of lead, mercury, and perfume that had seeped through her pores for decades now conspired to finish its work. Hair skin, yellowed and stretched thin over bone, began to darken at the edges. Her neck swelled, her lips fused, her eyes sank. Beneath the mountain of silk and lace, Her body emitted a smell so powerful that servants could barely stay in the room. Still, no one dared speak the truth. They burned incense and perfumed cloths, pretending it was divine fragrance rather than decay. When she finally drew her last breath, the illusion did not die with her. Her attendants refused to remove the makeup. They whispered that her face must remain divine. But the air grew heavy, the scent too strong to ignore. The toxins that had embalmed her in life now made her death unnatural. The corpse began to swell almost immediately. Fluid seeped from her nose and mouth, staining her linens. The room was sealed, the windows closed. Servants fainted. Physicians prayed. No one dared touch her for hours. When they finally approached to prepare her body, they found the damage irreversible. The skin beneath the powder had ruptured, peeling away in places where the lead had eaten through. Her cheeks were cratered with ulcers. Her lips had darkened to purple. They tried to wash her gently, but the flesh sloughed off like wet paper. In panic, they doused her with more perfume, more rose oil, more musk, until the air grew so thick with sweetness that men gagged. She must smell of heaven. One physician murmured, though the room smelled of nothing but death. Her coffin was ordered immediately, lined in crimson silk and sealed with iron bolts to contain the odor. Even so, the stench leaked through the wood. Guards were stationed around it in shifts of 10 minutes each, for no one could stand beside it longer. As her body lay in state, the public was told she looked serene. But behind closed doors, her attendants knew otherwise. The once pure face of England had turned blackened and sunken. One eye had collapsed inward. Her jaw had softened with decay. Her long reign of illusion had reached its end, and the truth of her mortality filled the air like poison. The funeral was postponed again and again. Officials blamed the weather, but whispers told another story, that her body was disintegrating too quickly to display. They wrapped her in layer upon layer of lace and linen, stitched her lips closed, and powdered her face one final time. A wax death mask was molded to replace her real features. The painters made her serene, beautiful, untouched by the horrors that lay beneath. They placed gloves on her hands to hide the swelling, and pearls around her neck to disguise the stains seeping through the fabric. When the coffin was finally carried through London, thousands gathered to mourn. They saw only the grandeur, the legend, not the dark patches spreading beneath the silk, nor the faint swarm of flies that followed the bier through the streets. To them, she was still the Virgin Queen, radiant and eternal. The truth remained sealed within the coffin, a secret guarded by perfume and myth. But those who walked nearest whispered that even outdoors, the stench clung to the air, that her scent, that dreadful sweetness, lingered on the wind long after the cortege passed. In Westminster Abbey, her body was placed beside her half-sister Mary, the woman she had once feared and outlived. The irony was cruel. Two queens who had despised each other in life now lay side by side in death. The embalmers did their best to disguise the damage, but the tomb was said to have exuded a faint, sickly aroma for years afterward. Visitors mistook it for incense. The monks knew better. Her death was not peaceful. It was a final unveiling. The mask that had hidden her humanity for 4 decades dissolved under the heat of her own corruption. And yet, even as her flesh decayed, her myth endured. England wept for a goddess, not a woman. Painters immortalized her as radiant. Poets called her eternal. But in the end, she had proven that power can preserve nothing, not even the skin it clings to. Her perfume, her paints, her silks, All the instruments of her glory had become her executioners. In that sealed coffin, beneath the lace and the legend, the real Elizabeth, the woman who had ruled, deceived, and suffered, was already gone. What remained was a body that reeked of both power and ruin. A final monument to her greatest lie, that she was untouched by time. In the dim quiet of Westminster Abbey, where echoes linger longer than prayers, there rests a tomb that was meant to silence the past, yet even century later, whispers say the air there still carries a faint sweetness, not of roses, but of something more unsettling. Beneath the marble lies Queen Elizabeth I, England's Virgin Queen. Embalmed in the fragrance of her own myth, the world remembers her for glory, for the Armada, for an empire born beneath her reign. But what history chose to bury was the truth of her body, the way it decayed long before it died. And so the Abbey became both a sanctuary and a warning, a monument to beauty's deception and to power's most intimate rot. The tomb itself is elegant, carved with cherubs and Latin inscriptions, proclaiming purity and triumph. Yet those who tended it in the years after her burial told another story. They claimed the stone wept with moisture on warm days, that a faint aroma of perfume and iron drifted from the cracks. Some said it was divine, others that it was the scent of her embalming oils, turning sour. The monks who kept the abbey in the 17th century whispered that flowers placed at her resting place wilted faster than anywhere else, as though the air still carried the residue of her poisons. People came to pay homage, unaware that the queen they adored had been slowly killing herself in pursuit of divinity. Above her lies a plaque that reads, "Partners in throne and grave. Here rest two sisters. Mary and Elizabeth, Fire and Frost, now sleep together in the same stone cradle." The irony is cruel, almost pudic. Mary had bathed in holy water. Elizabeth had feared it. Mary had burned heretics. Elizabeth had burned herself with vanity. And yet, it is Elizabeth whom the world remembers as the light of England. Even in death, her myth was the stronger perfume. Time did not erase her story. It refined it. Painters and poets continued to immortalize her white skin. Red curls, eyes of authority, the worms beneath the wigs, the sores beneath the gowns, the madness beneath the crown, all vanished beneath a sheen of national pride. The Virgin Queen became an emblem of eternal youth. Her death mask became her face. Her poison became her halo. The stench of her final days was rewritten as the scent of sanctity and England. Iga, Fajeros, believed the lie gladly. Yet even legend cannot silence truth forever. Centuries later, when her tomb was disturbed during restorations, the workers reported a lingering odor, faint, floral, and corrupted. It was said to cling to their hands long after they left the crypt, as though the ghost of her perfumes had waited for air. Historians dismissed it as imagination, but the story persisted that Elizabeth's tomb still breathes, that her beauty still decays, a scent without a body without a soul, the perfect metaphor for a reign that mistook artifice for eternity. In the end, Elizabeth achieved what she always desired. She was never forgotten, but not because of the paint, or the silks, or the sermons that called her divine. She endures because she was human in the most terrible way, fragile, fearful, and desperate to outlast her own reflection. The woman who ruled with brilliance and terror could not bear the truth of her own mortality, and so she painted over it, perfumed it, powdered it, until the mask became her skin. Even now, her story smells faintly of roses, turned rotten, a sweetness too heavy to be pure. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Virgin Queen, not the empire she forged, nor the poets she inspired, but the warning her body left behind. That power built on illusion always rots from the inside. That the pursuit of perfection demands a price the flesh cannot pay, and that even the most glorious crown, in time, becomes nothing more than a weight pressing down upon a skull. So when visitors walk the echoing halls of Westminster and stand before her marble effigy, and they see beauty, but they do not see truth, they bow before the tomb, not realizing that beneath that cold stone lies the most human secret of all that Elizabeth Tudor, England's brightest flame, never stopped burning. She simply burned herself alive,